Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 8th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we are joined by Amit Klein. He's the Vice President of Security Research at SafeBreach. A very special guest today. Amit, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your company.
Sure. SafeBreach is a company, a security company that provides a product that continuously and on an ongoing fashion scans and provides the information about the security status of the enterprise. As part of my role at the company as head of SafeBreach Labs is to provide the security content to SafeBreach's product. By that I mean the rules and the attack technologies and the techniques and all the nice little tricks that attackers may and do put in practice to get into the organization, to get the data, the sensitive data of the organization, and to exfiltrate this data out of the organization. To collect this data, my team first looks at the organizations, at our own customers. They analyze attacks against our own customers. They see what works and what not. Then we, of course, study closed source information from private forums and mailing lists. And, of course, we look at the public domain to collect information about new and evolving technologies. Obviously, part of our research is coming up with techniques and tricks of our own, which we share with the public through top-tier conferences like Hack in the Box in Amsterdam and, of course, Black Hat in USA. What I'm going to talk to you about today, Perfect Exfiltration, is exactly such topic. As for my own personal background, I'm 25 years now in information security, doing mostly security research. Started at the Israeli army, and then went through a series of 4 security startups in information security, of course. My previous role was with Trustir, which was sold to IBM as CTO. Prior to that, I was chief scientist with Toyota, that was acquired by RSA. And prior to that, I was the director of security and research for Sanctum, that was acquired by Watchfire, which is part of IBM now.
All right, very good. That's quite a background. And, one of the things that always seems to be the case is anybody that says that they've been in information security for more than about 15, maybe 20 years, is they've always been working in some form of the Department of Defense. That is, the commercial world didn't really recognize information security. It was really fostered by the governments. And in your case, I neglected to mention, you're joining us from Israel today. And absolutely welcome you here, and glad that you were able to join us. All right. We also have here Stan Nurilov. Stan, welcome back. And you've had a number of sleepless nights. I think a couple of programs ago we had mentioned.
Yeah. So I'm finally catching up on my sleep, apologizing to my wife, and trying to make things better.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what's been keeping you up, and it hasn't been necessarily a bad thing, although we're keeping you up with this botnet tracking activity now as well.
Yeah. So I'm also looking at the Mirai botnet and other of these IoT botnets, and that's my other hobby right now.
Okay, very good. And I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll get right back into it. Amit, you have, as you had suggested, you have the opportunity to do a lot of research and really kind of looking at what could happen so that we can find techniques to be able to counteract these types of techniques. And in particular, you have an article here around exfiltration. Tell us about it.
Thank you. So when Itzik, the company CTO, and myself started looking at exfiltration techniques to get into our product, we kicked off by looking at the public domain, at what is known, what the best and most comprehensive research can offer us in way of exfiltration techniques. Side by side with that, we started evaluating and compiling our own list of requirements and specifications to try to focus and to define exactly what perfect exfiltration needs to fulfill. What are the constraints that we think a perfect exfiltration technique should adhere to. And as we developed our constraints and requirements on one hand and surveyed the public knowledge about exfiltration technologies on the other hand, we started to realize that, in fact, none of the techniques that are suggested by researchers around the world actually fulfills our perfect exfiltration requirements. Mm-hmm. And that triggered the research to find the holy grail in our perspective, to find the perfect exfiltration technique or set of techniques. So just to get you an idea, what we had in mind for the requirements for perfect exfiltration revolved around assuming that the organization has perfect monitoring and reputation information available. So, for example, one cannot just connect from the internal network of the organization to an external machine, to an external IP somewhere on the other side of the internet without the monitoring products of the organization telling the CISO that someone is communicating with a suspicious or with a suspicious IP or an IP whose reputation is very low. Or there's no way to get around or to escape monitoring that looks at each and every packet and a series of packets from one source or from all sources to try to glean some meanings or to understand if there's a covert channel being established from an internal machine to an external machine. So all this, and of course, we also have to assume that the organization terminates all the encrypted SSL and TLS communications with the external world. And there are various such assumptions and requirements. We came up with 10 such requirements and restrictions. And eventually, we could not find any technology in the public domain, in the corpus of research that fulfills all 10 requirements. Just to give you a very quick example, there's a protocol field in the IP protocol, the Internet protocol, the workhorse of the Internet communications, which is called TOS, type of service. It's an 8-bit field, and it's typically unused by most machines, most operating systems out there. Mm-hmm. So what the covert channel that was suggested by one researcher many years ago was to use this field to transmit data from the internal network to the external network, mm-hmm. by simply transmitting 8 bits in each IP packet that's going from the internal machine to an external machine. However, if you look at the requirements that we had in mind for perfect exfiltration, it fails several of them. First, there is the question of the reputation of the external machine, of the IP address for the external machine. One would ask, why does this internal machine need to communicate with the external machine? But it gets worse. Any anomaly detection mechanism may detect the fact that the type of service field, which is typically 0, is being set to non-zero values, and that signifies an anomaly. And furthermore, there's an opportunity for disruption. If the gateway of the organization simply zeroes out this field prior to forwarding the packet to the external network, to the internet, then the covert channel is practically eliminated. Mm-hmm. So it's just a very basic example of how our requirements seem to eliminate a lot, or in our experience, all the technologies that were suggested by prior researchers. And then we came to define or to develop our own perfect exfiltration set of technologies. And I will give an example of one, probably a very interesting one, I think. And the idea here is this. the internal machine and the external machine, both under the attacker's full control, need to communicate. The internal machine needs to send data. Let's say it needs to send a single bit to the external machine. And by the way, a lot of the exfiltration, a lot of the reason behind the exfiltration calls for exfiltration of a very small set of data, a very small amount of data, like hundreds or maybe up to very few thousands of bits suffice to exfiltrate very sensitive data for an organization, maybe internal cryptographic keys and things like that. One does not need to transfer megabytes or gigabytes of health data if one has the key to get into the organization and steal them from the external internet as a result of exfiltration of this sensitive key. So we don't care about bandwidth. And in fact, if we demonstrate how we exfiltrate a single bit in a repeatable manner, it suffices. I don't need to really demonstrate exfiltrating gigabytes. So how do we exfiltrate a single bit according to one of our perfect exfiltration techniques? The attacker defines, the attacker needs to find a page that describes, say, a product on an e-commerce site, a very popular e-commerce site. It can be IKEA, it can be, eBay or any other such site. And in our experience, about 30% of those e-commerce sites exhibit the property that we need. It's not a vulnerability in the site itself. It's just a property that we need in order to use that site for exfiltration. And the property is that the site has a caching engine in front of the server that generates the product page, and the cache utility or functionality saves the saves the website's application engine from having to generate the product page again and again by caching the page for, say, 60 seconds or hour or whatnot, depending on the site's configuration. So in order to send a single bit from the internal machine to the external machine, the attacker chooses a page from such e-commerce site and chooses a specific time, like noon. And the internal machine, exactly at noon, makes an HTTP or HTTPS hit on that designated product page in the e-commerce site. So it in fact requests that page, and the page has to be not overly popular. So probably it should not reside in the cache prior to the internal machine requesting. So if it's a not overly popular product, we should be fine. And the internal machine makes an HTTP request to the page at hand. If the bit it needs to send is 1, and it makes no such hit if the bit to be sent is 0. After about approximately 10 seconds, just a number long enough to make sure that there is no problem with internet delay or so, the external machine makes a hit on the same page, and it observes the HTTP headers in the response. And if it observes that the page was generated at noon, exactly at noon, it knows that the internal machine did in fact hit that same page. If it observes that the page was generated at noon plus 10 seconds, it knows that no such hit was made, and the page was generated as a response for the request that the external machine just sent it. And this way, the external machine can extract the bit that was signaled by the internal machine, and that's and therefore we demonstrated how we transfer one bit from the internal machine to the external machine. The beauty of this method is that it's extremely difficult to understand that there is a covert channel in here. After all, from the organization's perspective, the internal machine just made a hit on a very popular website requesting an HTTP page. There's nothing sinister or anomalous about this. And so by sending several such bits over different e-commerce sites and different pages and products of those e-commerce sites, we can transfer hundreds or maybe thousands of such bits. And that's one of the perfect exfiltration technologies that we developed.
Yeah, so this is fascinating, and I really find the area of covert channels to be a really interesting one, because it's really has the opportunity for a complex puzzle.
Yeah, what's interesting, my thesis was in a very similar topic for my master's degree. I was always as well interested in covert communications in general. This is interesting because it kind of bridges so many different communications theory ideas, and I guess this is steganography as well, right? To communicate without letting somebody know that you're communicating. Interesting. Very interesting
absolutely.
research.
So I think, Amit, you had pointed out at the beginning of your discussion here that this is the last step in the cyber kill chain. I think that's perhaps a very key point here, is that, maybe I'm reading into this, so help me out here. Are you kind of suggesting that the last step in the cyber kill chain is not the best place to focus your efforts, that you should try to move your attack detection and remediation activities farther up the kill chain? Or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a fascinating topic in itself. It's probably worth, several hours of discussion, but I'll try to compress. So my answer is kind of a mixed in the sense that you definitely need to invest efforts, time, money in trying to address each and every link in the kill chain. Having said that, I think that Itzik and my research does not demonstrate that preventing exfiltration is futile. It does demonstrate that in some extreme conditions, even in some extreme conditions, exfiltration can still take place. But oftentimes, but what we did not demonstrate is a massive, a megabyte, gigabyte kind of exfiltration can happen without being noticed. That is what we did not demonstrate, and in fact, that was not our goal at all. And I think that first there's a lot of room for addressing the mega breaches and preventing lots of data from leaving your organization illegally. And I think that what we have demonstrated here is in a sense, work in progress or setting a higher bar. I don't think, maybe if we think about it more, if other researchers think about it more, they will be able to find a way to pinpoint this anomaly, even though, frankly, we did think about it quite a bit, and we did not find a way to nail down this particular kind of communications to set it apart from other types of legitimate communications. But maybe someone else will, in time, find a way, and things will be back in the game.
Well, that's actually a very good point. And so I think there are perhaps a few things here. One is to sort of point out, I guess my observation is that there are probably flaws in every sort of attack. And I think your observation here is that for most of the attacks today, exfiltration events are relatively detectable. That is, if you have the analysis in place to do it. And there are other places in the kill chain that perhaps things are detectable at, using a variety of different techniques. And so to be able to have some diversity in the methods that you're using to detect advanced attacks, at least you hope that it won't be the perfect attack across the kill chain, that there are points where you'll be able to pick up on it and have an opportunity to learn more about the characteristics, and then have a formidable and an effective remediation plan around that. And so that's, I guess, one aspect of this. And to your point, perhaps there are ways to detect this type of thing that is. And Stan and I were just actually talking earlier today about the opportunity for applying machine learning in cases where, maybe there are subtleties here that a person wouldn't pick up on, but if you have the right parameters in a machine learning tool, it may be able to pick up on normal behaviors and perhaps pick up on some anomalies in the behavior in this kind of scenario.
Absolutely. I think that you're right in both accounts. First is that even if you can't cover one link in the chain, possibly or ideally you will be able to cover other links in the chain. And on your second argument is exactly one way of looking at what I said earlier, and it is we don't really know. There is no mathematical proof that this exfiltration is indeed perfect, mathematically speaking. Maybe, as you said, new techniques will evolve that will be able to detect this kind of covert channel. Absolutely.
So, Amit, I just wanted to mention, I really love the concept that you're trying to raise the bar. I think that's a really important aspect of the work that you're doing. That is, there is a tendency to be thinking about, dealing with today's problem and not perhaps anticipating what tomorrow's problem might be and what challenges we would have. And so I think your research here is really valuable in that sense. So I commend you for that. So let's move on here. And Stan, you've been working on this malware analysis challenge, and I'd like, tell us a little bit about this. What is this challenge?
The company FireEye, they have a team that does, I guess it's an advanced team. They do malware, reverse engineering. They take apart exploits, and they try to really figure out how those things work. Probably, to make sure that their product is the best it could be. And while doing that, I almost call this like a public service. They put this challenge out there to let people compete to solve little reverse engineering puzzles. So what they'll do is I guess this is the third year they've been doing it, they'll put out a set of like executables that have like a little puzzle inside that you have to reverse engineer to decipher the answer. And as you advance through the challenges, the things get a little bit more complicated and complicated. So go ahead.
So this is really kind of like a capture the flag contest.
Yes.
But focused on malware analysis. So it not necessarily having to do network analysis per se, but
not
I presume that's a piece of
but
it.
they've evolved just this year to include certain components of that. So every year they kind of outdo themselves over and over again, right? So they add more of what they see in the field. And kind of what I like about the way they put the challenge together is that it is what they see, and the malware they provide, it's not exactly the malware they observe, but it uses a lot of the techniques that malware authors are using. And they're kind of, like I said, I think it's like almost like a public service where they're putting that out there, and it's probably better than any training you could take, because a lot of training out there, it talks about maybe using a specific tool or is teaching you exactly how to do analysis. Well, with these challenges, it's very open-ended. You can use any technology you want, and actually you learn at your own pace. So
I want to just emphasize a couple of points you just made there, because I think they're really important. One is that generally when you go to a training course or something like that, they're spitting stuff at you. You're in kind of receive mode, not so much the doer mode.
Yes.
And then the second aspect that you're sort of pointing out is that in the real world, especially in analysis, there isn't a prescribed path that you take. You have to figure out of the 10 choices of things that you might do, and it might be 1,000 different choices, which are the best paths to take or the most likely opportunities for success.
Exactly. And doubly so with like reverse engineering, it's kind of like this advanced voodoo magic kind of field where the guys who are in the know, or the guys and girls who are in the know, they kind of know how it works, but it's really hard to transfer that knowledge. So by doing these, you kind of building up your own compendium of techniques that you see. And really for reverse engineering, to me, it's all about that. It's recognizing certain patterns and then being able to say, oh, okay, I know what this is. And so as you know more patterns, you become much quicker. And so in your real job as a malware analyst or as any kind of analyst, really, you are quicker at making assessments. Your gut instinct becomes a lot better. And with this challenge in particular, like for me, I've evolved my understanding of all the different kinds of malware families there are. And this year, they added so much more challenge to it. It made it so much more challenging by just tweaking a few things. Definitely, and it's a 6-week thing, and I spent like, I didn't get into it until like week 2. I spent like 4 weeks not sleeping, doing it, because you really, like when you're into it, you're really into it, and I kind of have to thank them for giving me an opportunity to geek out. And I have to thank my family for giving me an opportunity to geek out. But it's, the challenges vary. I mean, they use different kinds of technologies, from like x86 binary reverse engineering to like reverse engineering Python scripts, or the last challenge that they had was using Flash and like analyzing almost like a Flash exploit. So they give you, and this is a real problem that we have to deal with, and actually it kind of points back to the kinds of things that Amit was talking about. They give you this PCAP file, and there's no context. There's something bad here, and it's 21 megabytes, go look for it, right? And so you kind of use your analysis techniques to start saying, okay, in these 21 megabytes, which is a lot for a PCAP file to manually review, what is the bad thing? And so you kind of start and build up. And I really like the way in this particular challenge, they kind of intertwine the malware analysis with the network observation. We talked about, steganography or even cryptography. You can encrypt things. Well, in this challenge, I actually didn't succeed in it, but the hardest part of it I did is you had to break like the encryption key to get to the next step of it. And usually breaking encryption is actually pretty hard unless it's not implemented correctly. And just being able to recognize those kinds of things. I just, from the 3 years I've been doing it, I've learned how to look at code and recognize what encryption algorithm is being used. Like base 64 is not really encryption, but an obfuscation. RC4, MD5, like I can look at a piece of code now, like the Matrix, and I'm like, oh, that's MD5. That's the state table for AES and things like that. So for people who are starting out and they really find this field exciting, doing these kinds of challenges, I think, is the best way to learn. Like you learning at your own pace. And the other thing is that once the challenge is over, all the security researchers who are participating in this, they put write-ups out there. So if you weren't able to succeed in a particular part, you can now learn. So the next time you can get better and better. And you actually see like the community, I think, growing. There's like a Twitter handle and people are following each other and they're giving each other props. So you get to know the people who are in this community, because it is a pretty small community, I would say, of people who are actually capable of doing these things, but they get to at least know each other. You can rely on different people to do different things. If you have a malware analysis environment, doing this challenge might help you understand like what you're missing. Like what tools aren't we taking advantage of that we should be? What analysis techniques aren't we using? So like my default is to go to like static analysis. That's where you don't execute the malware at all. And I'd like to think, good at that. But in this challenge, that's not the most efficient way. In this challenge, you gotta run the malware, otherwise you'll be reversing it for the next 100 years. But you wanna learn, like, how do I instrument it so that I'm looking at it, I'm stopping at the right point to observe what it's doing. So there's no better teacher than really just doing it. And I find that even though a very challenging, sleepless experience, still very rewarding. It kind of like pays for itself.
So you actually made a few points that I wanted to, again, sort of re-emphasize. One is that you pointed out that this is based on some of the techniques that are used by real actors. And so it's not really just made up, although the specifics around it are not exactly like some of the real actors might be using. I think that's really pertinent in the sense that, if the real malicious actors are changing their techniques, you don't want to be lost in that, and, dependent on a signature, for example. We all know that, the traditional antivirus, signature-based antivirus doesn't work well because it's so dependent on the very specifics of the attack. So I think you're pointing out a very important thing in the sense that most organizations will have very little opportunity to experience a specific type of advanced attack until they've been a victim.
That's right.
And so this is an opportunity to learn about some of the techniques that are being used, not just a specific technique, but the essence around those, so that you'll be able to develop the skills to recognize it and to be able to isolate it and be able to deal with it.
Exactly.
I think another point that you made is that it is a relatively small community, and for any type of activity that you're involved in, this is a specialization, and to be able to have something like this to help find others that are developing similar skills is a very important networking capability. So we're glad you're here. And we hopefully have fewer opportunities for you to exercise those skills here, but certainly opportunities to be able to help our customers and help others and develop those skills. So a very important part of this. Amit, do you have any comments?
I was thinking about this right now, and I think it's also kind of in line with some thoughts I had about reverse engineering in general. And if I think the way I look at reverse engineering in general is that it's kind of a linear activity, in the sense that if you give me X kilobytes of binary code, I can probably reverse engineer it in Y days or Y hours or Y weeks, whatever. So there's kind of it's linear in the sense that if I throw in 100 people, 100 even mediocre reverse engineers, they'll probably be able to come up with a reasonably readable source code in a predictable amount of time. The thing is, the crux of the matter is that this predictable time is going to be huge, in fact. So if we are looking at a megabyte of binary code, especially if it's a bit obfuscated, it may take months or maybe even more for a single person to come up with readable source code. Maybe even years. I can't really tell. And here comes the art of reverse engineering. The art is that we do not necessarily need to reverse engineer each and every binary machine instruction into its counterpart source code. Typically we need to answer few very specific questions that are maybe tactical, such as how does this malware process this file, or what is the protocol and key or for the command and control communication. And someone skilled in the art and profession of reverse engineering can answer this question much quicker than reverse engineering the whole bunch of binary instructions that represent the complete malware. So it's all. So in theory, reverse engineering is straightforward. In practice, it's the art of taking shortcuts and applying various tricks, and maybe even combining static and dynamic analysis to answer questions that do not necessarily need the access to the full source code of the malware. That's my view of this profession.
That's an excellent point, and I think you need to make the recommendation stand to FireEye. This really needs to be the reverse art challenge. I think Amit's point is actually right. It's taking it beyond methodology and science and turning it into a matter of making good judgment in a particular situation. That ultimately is an art.
Yeah, but at the same time, while you're doing that, while you're learning the art, you take the lessons learned and apply them to a more methodical, rigorous way. So a lot of malware these days...
Well, there is engineering in that. So it's engineering reversing the art.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, I find that, a lot of times when we are, it does take a lot of effort to go and look at a sample. But once you do, you're usually learning some technique that's pretty reusable, that you can write a script or a methodology around to start extracting that metric, going forward. And now you don't have to do that part of it, and you're just combining these little metrics to make the art much faster. And then of course, I don't even know, like the human brain is just amazing. Just being able to like look at a piece of code and recognize that that's an algorithm potentially. I don't even know how you put a methodology around it. And I think to your guys' point, that's exactly the art component of it.
Yeah, very good point. There are a lot of artists that have learned how to mimic Van Gogh, but there is only one that created it in the first place. And I think that's the kind of thing that it's really creating those new techniques and then being able to put them in a methodology. You've got it exactly right. All right, so I guess the next thing we'd like to cover here is some viewer mail. We got some email from Patrick, and this relates to actually in episode 218. This was actually the Dirty Cow episode if you're on the ThreatTraq site. It was discussing data that was leaked by pagers and useful for critical infrastructure attacks. So this was actually an article that was originally written by Trend Micro and published, where they collected, I think, on the order of about 55 million pager messages in various places and found things like, health information and, potentially critical infrastructure control information, usually, status type things. And so Patrick wrote email. He said, are the authorities watching this? Is it available to them? And the first answer is effectively, ThreatTraq's available to the public. It's available to anybody so that they would have a resource to be able to learn about these kinds of things. Of course, Trend Micro, I think, published that paper also with the same notion in mind, that is, folks that are using pager systems in this way really need to understand that these types of things exist. So, but there's actually a little bit of a question about who the appropriate authorities would be in this particular case, because we're looking at health information was one example. I think there was also the potential around power plants and that might be involved in this, and perhaps other industrial control systems. There are different regulating authorities associated with those organizations, like HIPAA requirements associated with health information. I think this could potentially be a case where certain organizations have what I like to call compliance-itis, which is I'm focused on being compliant, and if the requirements don't say something about how you use pager systems, perhaps they're not reviewing how pager systems are being used. So we get those sorts of subtleties that tend to exist. And PCI requirements specifically note Wi-Fi as one of the threats. It was because there was actually a historical event, one of the first, what I would think a large credit card theft case was related to an improperly protected Wi-Fi environment where somebody was able to actually sit out in the parking lot and start collecting credit card information. Not a good scenario. So they changed the PCI requirements for payment card industry to make sure that rogue Wi-Fi sites or Wi-Fi sites that weren't well protected were covered as a part of the compliance. And that's the sort of thing, is that the folks that are writing the compliance rules really need to be involved here, but more so, folks that are running organizations need to get past compliance and really be thinking strategically about the security controls that need to be in place to protect their environment. So that's one sort of consideration that perhaps is in mind here. A second one, I think all too often the notion around confidentiality and integrity being basically grouped together, and reliability or availability are oftentimes overlooked. I think that's a really important aspect of considering security systems. So this being an example, there are in fact encrypted pager solutions that are available, but perhaps they chose to use the less complex, less fraught for failure in favor of availability. That is, if you want a system to be reporting its status to say, I can't read this thing, or I'm not able to measure the temperature correctly, is just a hypothetical example, you'd want that message to get through without anything inhibiting the success of that. So that is perhaps a deliberate decision on the part of the folks that implemented this system. I doubt that that's the case.
Yeah, I wonder if they just didn't think about it.
Yeah, it's a good possibility. So, and then the last one would be here is what I like to refer to as the policy erosion principle. Is generally speaking, most likely these pager systems were put into place for a specific purpose, and somebody said, you know what, I can use that for this other thing. And if the folks that implemented that did not consider that other thing, then perhaps the security requirements around it weren't fully considered. So, originally pagers were used to just call people's attention to something, call me back. And that would be relatively innocuous because it wouldn't be disclosing information. It would just be, a page, a number, phone number went out every once in a while. And then it evolved to be, okay, well, we can add some text information, and then it becomes a hazard about what sort of text information is involved in it. And I suspect that that's most likely the case. So how do we fix this type of problem? Well, first of all, I think education is a big part of this. That is, the folks that are doing the analysis, or doing the engineering or the implementations of systems, not only need to be considering the systems they're going toward, but considering the systems that are in place and whether the policy erosion principle has taken place, or if perhaps they aren't paying attention to things that are outside of what the word of the compliance is. And last but not least, make deliberate decisions about whether availability, integrity, or confidentiality are important aspects of the system, and making sure that those are implemented. So I don't know, Stan, do you have any other comments about this?
Well,
you look like you're on the edge of your seat.
Yeah,
ready to say something. Sorry.
I figure with, a lot of times when people put a system together, especially at the moment in time they're in, they, like you mentioned, maybe they don't think through all of the possibilities. Mm-hmm. I like your comment about, the pagers were used for sending an alert. Well, maybe even if they had done a risk assessment, sending this or that piece of information, not that big a deal. Mm-hmm. Now, when you start combining all of this information,
all the pieces and parts,
does that make a bigger impact than what you had originally predicted? Because you can definitely get an exception for, hey, I can send the temperature out, that's no big deal. Mm-hmm. Hey, I can send out the up and down status, but what about together? Now that you're sending out all of this information, does mm-hmm. that change the risk rating or something mm-hmm. like that? Should we do more? Another part of that is...
I just want to emphasize, you made a good point there, because I think one of the contexts around this analysis, and by the way, I meant to say earlier, I think this is an excellent finding by Trend Micro. I think they've done a good thing here by raising attention to this and making it very practical. It's not even just a theoretical thing, it's something that they said this really exists, and really making sure that the word gets out. And I'm hoping that they've made sure that some of the organizations, the compliance authorities and DHS, for example, if it's critical infrastructure, are aware of this this publication. But you made the point that one of the scenarios that they had talked about is the ability to use this information to perhaps use social engineering or some sort of a phishing attack to say, include some contextual information to say, like, this person must know what they're talking about. They must be authoritative because they know what they're talking about, and to use that as a part of an attack.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of risk profiles they probably didn't get into if they did a risk assessment at mm-hmm. all. Most often when you're using a technology that you don't think anybody's snooping on, you don't really think about confidentiality mm-hmm. all that much. Just the channel of communication is kind of, an encryption itself in a mm-hmm. sense, because nobody knows how to decrypt it. But here we are years later, right, with these systems still in use, where it's much more practical to be able to sniff the channel or read into the channel. So now all the secrets are open, mm-hmm. and so maybe if there was any protection in there or any risk assessment that they did do and use this as a reason, they did not anticipate mm-hmm. years later still being in use and other people now being able to freely view this information.
Okay.
So a couple of things there.
Yeah, absolutely. Amit, any additional thoughts from you?
Yeah, my comment about this is that I don't see pagers as much different than telephony calls and fax. If you think about it, there's a lot of, say, health information and other sensitive personal information going on, being disclosed in telephony calls and fax messages. And these two can also be intercepted especially if they are going through non-wire media such as point-to-point connections, radio connections, or satellite connections. So I don't see that as very different in nature than the research about pagers. And we should, if we think about how to harden pager connections, I do think that we need to apply the same kind of standards to telephony and to fax. There's another kind of communication which is perhaps less vulnerable, but still needs to be considered, and that's the surface mail system. Also something that can be in ways intercepted and also carries a lot of personal information. So there are some, when we have bolstered up the typical, the internet network communications, people start looking at other communications to extract personal information. And there are, in fact, some communication systems, as we mentioned, pagers, telephony, fax, surface mail, that are vulnerable.
Well, and actually, you reminded me. Your comments here reminded me. I agree with you thoroughly. The additional aspect of this that I hadn't mentioned earlier is that, it's part of that policy erosion thing. But there are two angles to the policy erosion, and that things get implemented with a particular use in mind, and then they get, I'll say, misused or used in different ways over time, and it becomes a security issue. But on top of that, over time, the threat has changed. There have been significantly greater motivations to steal credit card information, to steal identity information, and use that as a means to monetize that information. And so we have to look at both angles in terms of the security policy erosion. That is, we shouldn't assume that things we implemented 10 years ago, just because they were okay 10 years ago, that they're still okay today. Because even if they're just used in the same way, they may, in fact, the threat may have changed, the technology to attack them may have changed, and the motivation to attack them may have changed. So I appreciate your comments, very good. So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and we're going to start with what is looks a little bit like a Pac-Man. I think we've mentioned this before. Port 23 is really over the top, as we'd expected, and we've been talking about this for quite some time, since I think way back in 2014 when they started doing compromise activities at a smaller scale of these IoT devices. But this is that MirEye botnet and variations around that. And Stan, you've been doing some research into this and finding the command and control servers and activity associated with it. And lots of other variants are sort of popping up and around.
Yeah. Ever since the source code was released, the amount of variants, I think, first of all, the bar of entry has been lowered, so anybody can just compile and kind of distribute. And there's lots of variants out there. There's, I would call like legitimate DDoS services. They're not legitimate, but they have like a whole business around them. Even they are using variants of MirEye to provide their DDoSing service,
right.
As well as nefarious groups.
And while Amit here is trying to raise the bar in terms of what we're looking at from a security standpoint, this is a really low bar. I mean, these are devices that have a default password coded in the firmware. You can't even change the password in many cases. So that's a formidable challenge. And there are a lot of folks that are taking a look at what needs to be done to deal with the safety of devices that are sold to consumers, so that this type of thing doesn't continue forward. Underwriters Laboratories has been looking at setting some standards around this, but I think the mindset currently is still, in fact, there are a number of other groups writing standards or guidelines for security of IoT or anything that connects to the internet for that matter. But it's a difficult challenge because the guidelines are great for the folks that are paying attention to those things. It doesn't do so well for the folks that are not paying attention, or even especially in a case where they might be intentionally subverting things. So there's still some work that needs to go into this. So I should cover a couple of the other ports that we're seeing here. Next in line is port 2323, and I think it was actually a variant or a particular type of IoT device that was using port 2323 as an alternate port for Telnet. So that basically equates to Telnet default password guessing as well, followed by port 80 TCP, and we're going to take a little closer look at that one a little bit later on. So it looks like there's perhaps some growth targeting the web interfaces on these devices, and then followed by 3389 TCP. We'll take a look at that one a little bit later on because that is also showing some long-term growth and activity. That's a remote desktop protocol, followed by 22 TCP, that's SSH. There are in fact some devices, I think some home routers for example, you can enable SSH access from the internet in some cases, and so that's a case where that type of activity is being targeted. And then followed by 123 UDP, that's network time protocol. That gets used for setting the clocks on computers, but also, unfortunately, if there is an NTP server available on the internet, it can be used for reflective denial of service attacks. Followed by 445 TCP, that's generally configure activity still, that's a Microsoft NetBIOS port. Followed by 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database. And then we see ICMP type 8 is actually associated with basically a ping request. So it's really just general probing on the network. And then finally 53 UDP, looking for DNS servers and oftentimes used, again, in reflective denial of service attacks. So we'll take a little closer look at a few of these in a couple of moments here. This next pie chart looking at the most sources that are doing that probing. This is a case where we're counting the number of unique IP addresses that are performing the probing on each of these ports. And again, port 23 is a significant part of that, about 75% of the activity, followed by, again, some of the same ports that we had just listed out. 2323 TCP, 80 TCP, 445 TCP. We have one that's unique here, 27015 UDP. And we're going to take a little closer look at that one because that one did jump up 20 spots in terms of the ranking, and then followed by 22 TCP, and we have some ICMP ports that are basically, I'll call it reactive or backscatter type activities generally. Looking more closely at port 23 TCP, first of all, I'll talk about the bottom graph. The bottom graph here is really showing the number of source addresses that are doing scanning activity, and it's still at significantly elevated activities. We're looking at on the order of about 300,000 sources in any given hour that are being, basically, they're performing the scanning activity. And we saw a little bit of a dip over the last week, but it seems to be picking up. And I think this is new sort of variants that are popping into the scene. And then I should point out, and I think perhaps John Hogan talked about it, we did see sort of a drop in the activity. That is perhaps devices that have been taken offline, either blocked in some way, that had been had been identified as participating in these botnets, or perhaps the end users recognized the issue and have taken them offline. So we have seen a little bit of a drop in that activity. Now looking at the top graph, this is the number of probes that are taking place. And what we're seeing is that over the last week or so here, actually less than a week or so, is a significant increase in the number of probes. So I think this is, Stan, as you had alluded to, variants that are coming onto the scene and are perhaps scanning even much more aggressively. And so that has actually resulted in a significant increase overall in the scanning activity we're seeing on the network.
And just to point out, based on the graph and what I know about the release of the botnet, when the person released the bot, the author released the source code, they mentioned that at the height, they were able to have like 350,000 participants, and actually correlates very well with this graph. And they said after some takedown activity, they saw it go down to 300. I think if you review the graph again, you'll see that that's exactly kind of where we're seeing it.
Right around where it is.
Exactly.
Yep. And there is some other activity in there. So the MirrorEye is basically the one that's most readily recognized, but they don't have a lock on this area.
No.
So we should recognize the fact that there are and have been other botnets that have been performing this activity.
But it seems like this is the sweet spot of the number of devices that are out there that are susceptible to this.
The next item here is the scan probes and sources on port 2323 TCP. Again, this is just another device type that's being targeted. There are not as many of them, but in terms of the number of sources that we're seeing, in the order of maybe 10,000 or so, we did see an early spike in the activity, and it seems to be, I will say, leveled off or in the activity. So some of the devices, some of the malware, I think, scans both ports, 23 and as well as 2323. And so there's some crossover in that activity. The next item here is I just wanted to share sort of the aggregate. This is looking over the last 3 years of activity and scan probes on vulnerable IoT devices. And this is actually, I think really kind of testimony to how this activity has changed over the last 3 years. It really kind of started back in, say late 2013 into, say, February 2014, where we started to see some early activity around this. And the first activity that we saw that was really kind of notable around, IoT devices was actually a port 5000. It was a management port for network attached storage. So that's this early sort of light green blip that we're seeing over here on the left side of the graph. And then as we progressed to the right, we saw some other ones pop into play. One in particular was a backdoor port 53413 UDP that was associated with Netis routers. It was you can basically encapsulate a script into the payload of the packet, and it'll execute that script. And so that's what that yellow activity is that spiked up on here a couple of times. And then later what we see is the telnet activity is really taken over. And the blue activity, by the way, at the bottom happens to be relatively stable, but certainly a part of this attempts to do password guessing attacks on port 22 or SSH. So the telnet activity, the green one, really climbed significantly, actually very recently. I don't think we're done with this yet.
No.
So we'll have to see how that tracks over the next few days. And then notable, even on port 80, we've seen some botnet activity. This is looking at the number of sources that are scanning on port 80 TCP. Now, you'd expect that there might be some scanning activity on port 80 anyway, kind of looking around to see what websites exist. And so we typically see on the order of about 5,000 sources, but this jumped up to 80,000 sources in no time flat. Clearly botnet activity. Taking a look at the sources of that activity, it does seem to be connected with IoT type activity. So it's not just looking for regular websites, I suspect. I think what they're doing is looking for devices because, quite frankly, these devices, they expose a web interface to the internet. This is the closed circuit TV camera DVRs. They expose a web interface to the internet so you can log into the devices and see the cameras. And some of these cases, they have a authentication bypass issue associated with it. Sometimes the passwords aren't set on them. And then I think John Hogeboom had been able to identify that there is in fact a case where they actually have a PowerShell in the device so that you can actually issue Linux commands and perhaps incorporate it into a botnet as well. So I don't know for a fact, but that may be what they're looking for in this particular case. So that activity has tapered off over this is actually looking at the activity started about a week ago, right around the time of the last ThreatTraq report. And it has settled out a little bit, but perhaps isn't over yet. And just a couple more items I wanted to share with you. The next one is port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, looking at the last year of activity. And it looks like the activity has basically doubled or so, perhaps a little bit more than that, maybe tripled or quadrupled over the last year or so. And but we'll have to see if that actually stabilizes that way. But this is concerning because sometimes point of sale devices, registers, being Windows-based devices, sometimes have remote desktop protocol enabled on those, and it's potentially a vector for doing credit card theft activity. So obviously that's not a desirable thing. So if you have a point of sale device or actually any computer, make sure remote desktop protocol is shut down unless you absolutely need it. And the last item here, scan sources on port 27015 UDP. That's basically a port that's associated with Half-Life gaming servers. Folks might set up gaming servers to be able to have their own gaming groups and such. I believe the motivation here is that port, being a UDP port, can be used for reflective denial of service attacks. So this is clearly botnet activity again. We're seeing it went from 0 to 11,000 sources scanning on that port. And it has that sort of telltale or that taper, that decay pattern that's typically associated with a botnet activity. So I suspect it's a botnet looking for servers that they might be able to use in denial of service attacks. We have not seen any significant activity using this port in denial of service attacks, although we have seen a little bit. I wouldn't describe it as significant, so hopefully it'll stay that way. Still, I think the predominant port for these reflective denial of service attacks is associated with DNS, port 53 UDP. So Amit, any final comments before we close out here?
Just, I'd be interested in the charts that you presented, specifically the ones that pertain to attacks against the IoT. I would very much love to see another chart over this one, or together with this one, showing the growth of the IoT devices around the world, and to see whether which one outpaces the other, or do they grow the same in the same pace. It would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And this is actually looking at probing activity, not necessarily the number of sources or the number of devices that are infected. I think the previous graph that we looked at, so this is actually a very pertinent point that you're bringing up, is how aggressive the probing activity is not necessarily a strong reflection of how many devices are actually infected or even how many devices are out there. Although there is certainly a correlation, it's not a direct correlation necessarily. So when we look at this graph, it kind of shows the combination of the two, and if we looked at a 3-year view, we'd certainly still see a very significant growth in the number of sources that are participating. And but there are a couple of other factors we have to take into account. One is there somebody motivated to find them? And secondly, is there somebody, or are there known exploits that can be used against them? And it's the combination of those three. How many devices are out there, knowledge of the exploit, and folks motivated to go find them and exploit them, that all have an influence on the growth over time. So very good point. I don't have any specific statistics on the availability or how many devices are out there, or it would be perhaps useful to do it. We could perhaps do well, I guess we don't have historical information from Shodan, and that would be perhaps one resource to be able to find this kind of information, but we'd need historical information to do that. So it's a good observation. That is, to understand what influencing factors exist here is an important part of it. So very good. That's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. And you can find AT&T ThreatTraq in 3 places. It's on the AT&T Tech channel, it's on YouTube, and as well on iTunes in an audio cast version. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. Amit, I'd like to give you a special thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And even though you're thousands of miles away from us, I think we really felt that we've developed a close bond. So I really, again, appreciate you being here. Stan, thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Brian Rixford. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.